We are here today with some two wonderful men who have a place in history. Howard Willens has written the first really inside account of the Warren Commission. He kept a diary and was essentially assistant general counsel, as we'll show you, for the Warren Commission. And next to him is Judge Burke Griffin, who has been a judge here in Cuyahoga County for many years and was also a staff member of the Warren Commission. So I thought what we'd do to start off with is take a look at the structure of the commission to start with, so that you know where they fit into this structure and how they work. They did start their work in December of 1963, and by September of 64, they delivered the Warren report. So that's the time frame that they had to complete this massive investigation. It's incredible. Now, I'll also tell you my own prejudice here, which is that these guys are real heroes in the sense that they were young men. They had no template, as we'll talk about. This was an extraordinary time. They were under extraordinary pressure. They had people who were very much assisting them and people who were resisting them. And yet they still came to, I think, some very good results here, which we'll talk about. So with that said, let's first allow these two to introduce themselves. Howard, perhaps a few moments on yourself and how you got here today.
Well, how I got here today to this very efficiently run operation is by cab. And it's an honor to be in an institution of this kind with 100+ years of oratory and history. And I'm honored to be here with my colleague, Judge Griffin, who has dedicated his last several months to generating enthusiasm for my book, in part because I treat him very favorably indeed. So I look forward to your questions, and I will try from time to time to provoke you into asking them. So be forewarned.
Okay. Bert?
I want to say a few words about the book.
Okay.
And simply, this is a great detective story. And if you like detective stories, you'll really enjoy reading Howard's book. History will prove us right. Now, I also want to say something about how I got on the Warren Commission staff, because I see Dick Pogue here. And Dick, this is all the result of David Filveroff. I don't know if, do you remember Dave Filveroff? Dave Filveroff was a young lawyer when I was a young lawyer at Jones Day, which was then Jones Day, Revis, and Pogue, and they dropped your name out of it. Too bad.
No offense.
I used to get invited to young people's parties at Jones Day, and Filveroff was there. And then Filveroff left to go to work for the Justice Department. And I took him off our Christmas card list. But right after Christmas, he called me. I thought he was calling because he was going to complain. But he asked me if I would be interested in working for the Warren Commission. And once I concluded that he hadn't dialed the wrong number, I said yes. Now, I will tell you this other part of the story. I had to go to the partners in the law firm. In those days, this was McDonald, Hopkins, and Hardy. It's now down to McDonald, Hopkins. And I was the 7th lawyer. They now have about 200, I think. Anyhow, I went to the partners, and I remember vividly when I approached this one partner, I won't give his name, he said, well, Bert, you ought to think about this. These government jobs aren't all they're cracked up to be. He said, I was in the OPA during the Second World War, the Office of Price Administration, for any of you who don't remember that. That was a pretty dull job. I did not think that working with the Warren Commission was going to be a dull job, and it was not.
That's wonderful. All right, so let's get into, we're going to talk a little bit about the actual commission itself. I want to start with Earl Warren and how LBJ convinced Warren to take this job. Now think about this. You've got a guy who is the full-time Chief Justice of the United States. And Howard, in history past, it's been a bad idea for justices to work on any work outside of the court, and Warren was resistant. Maybe you can tell the story a little bit.
Yes, Chief Justice Warren was approached initially by the Solicitor General of the United States, Archibald Cox, and the Deputy Attorney General, Nick Katzenbach, and asked if he would chair the commission to be appointed by the President. He declined. in part because he knew from history that the justices who had previously served, in one case investigating Pearl Harbor, another case serving as prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, had a divisive and adverse effect on the court. So he declined, and of course he received a call from the president immediately thereafter, and he walked obediently up to the White House to explain to President Johnson why he could not assume these responsibilities. The President Johnson, as you know, had legendary powers of persuasion, from twisting arms to encouraging people to do the right thing for the wrong reasons, or vice versa. And he told Chief Justice Warren that his service now in this capacity would be equivalent in importance to his service as a soldier back in the First World War. He appealed to his patriotism, to the importance of this, the possible international repercussions, and in effect, then the Chief Justice, with tears in his eyes, virtually acquiesced in accepting the appointment. LBJ's next job was to persuade Senator Richard Russell from Georgia to become a part of the commission. President Johnson wanted 4 members from Congress on the commission, 2 senators, 2 representatives, 2 from each party, because he wanted to make certain that the result of the Warren Commission would at least have the input of experienced politicians who would have some sense of what the public expected, and also be aware that their own personal and political reputations depended on the substance of the report and the degree to which it was accepted by the public.
We're looking right now at a picture of Senator Russell with LBJ. He was kind of his mentor.
Senator Russell and LBJ went far back in history. The only thing they disagreed about was race. Senator Russell was the head of the anti-civil rights branch of the Senate, and in fact was fully committed to opposing all the civil rights legislation that President Johnson proposed. Senator Russell had a personal dislike and disdain for the Chief Justice because of his liberal rulings and the extent to which they had challenged the very foundations of the culture of our southern states. President Johnson listened to Russell's pleas not to be appointed. He listened carefully to his concerns about the Chief Justice. He reminded the senator about their relationship and how far they went back into history together. Indeed, Senator Russell was instrumental in producing the majority chairmanship for then Senator Johnson. And he tried to persuade Senator Russell to change his mind without success, and he finally announced to the senator that he had to assume the position because President Johnson had already announced it to the press.
Yeah. And it's a great phone call. You know, Johnson recorded a lot of his phone calls, and so he calls him and says, "I've just announced you're on this commission." And he said, "No, you haven't." He really did not want to be on that commission. But think about one fact here that I think we're getting to. You have a Supreme Court, you have the courts represented, Supreme Court Justice, 2 from the Senate, 2 from the House, and then we're going to have 2 other members. Those are going to be the commissioners. So there's a very deliberate structure being put here, the whole government involved in this, and Russell was very reluctant. Remember, that year is also the year of the Civil Rights Act. So these people are going to be very busy with their day jobs, and that's why these guys on the staff assumed most of the responsibility for the work. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But let's talk about the commission itself now that we've introduced Earl Warren and Senator Russell. We now are going to go through Warren himself, and then Gerald Ford was one of the congressmen. Reaction or discussion about him?
Yes, he was the Republican representative, of course, from the House of Representatives. He was from Michigan, as you know, a great athlete, a great alumnus of that wonderful institution. And I see
which Howard went to.
and I see in the room an old friend of mine, Mr. Neary, who was class behind me from the University of Michigan, and it's an honor to see him after so many decades. In any event, Ford had a real interest in this. He was very conspiratorially oriented. He also had a staff of 2 or 3 people that were working behind the scenes, helping him evaluate the materials that were generated by the staff, and he had the clear intention of writing a book in the immediate aftermath of the commission. He took an active interest. His attendance record was better than most. He was particularly interested in cross-examining government officials from the State Department in particular. And so he, of course, went on to become president for a short period of time in the 1970s.
He had a relationship with a guy named Deke DeLoth, who was an FBI guy, where he would, how would you describe that relationship?
Well, the FBI, of course, had a vested interest under J. Edgar Hoover in keeping in touch with decision makers, both in the executive branch and on the Hill. And Representative Ford, who was rising in the, his side of the party, did have an amicable relationship with the public information officer of Hoover's FBI. And so there was a practice of the FBI official dropping by Ford's office from time to time to ask leading questions and report them assiduously, if not accurately, to his boss. And so here there was a problem in that Gerald Ford in the initial meetings, after the initial meetings, was briefing the FBI through Deloitte as to what the commission was considering. And J. Edgar Hoover was quite pleased with that, but the members of the commission were particularly upset with that, and we learned about this many years later, of course. But Ford promised his colleagues that he would not divulge the secrets of the commission to the FBI.
All right, Bert, let's take a look at three other members of the commission: John Cooper, John McCloy, and Hale Boggs. Starting with Hale Boggs, describe who he is. He's also the father of a current journalist.
Right. Suddenly you asked me. I can't think of it. She's on NPR.
Roberts.
Cokie
Roberts.
Cokie Roberts is
Yeah.
his father.
Yeah.
Hale Boggs had I think he was the majority whip. Am I right, Howard? He's a Democrat from Louisiana. He was the majority whip, so he's a person who exercised a lot of influence in the House. When you get further in these slides, you'll see the name, at least, of Leon Hubert, who was my partner in working on the Jack Ruby end of things. And Hubert was from Louisiana and was a good friend of Boggs, and I think that was an important factor in Hubert's being a part of the commission staff.
Good. What about John McCloy and John Cooper? Who are they?
Well, John McCloy was a great guy because he's a graduate of the Amherst College class of 1914, and I graduated 40 years later in 1954. This could be called the Amherst conspiracy, but it really wasn't because we didn't know each other.
He was the head of the World Bank. And
he'd headed the World Bank, and he had been High Commissioner to Germany right after the Second World War. He was a very respected person, and he had himself, as a younger man, a younger lawyer in the 20s, had participated in a very significant investigation during that period. John Sherman Cooper was a liberal Republican from Kentucky. Okay. And he was also a very respected member of the Senate.
All right, and then Howard, to round it out, the last of the commissioners, Allen Dulles.
Yes, well, there's some uncertainty as to exactly how Allen Dulles got on the commission. One respected historian says that both Dulles and John McCloy were recommended by Robert Kennedy. Another commentator said that couldn't possibly be so because Dulles had been asked to resign after the debacle of the Bay of Pigs. And
he had been the CIA director.
When he was the CIA director. But in any event, he was there, and of course, in retrospect, it's my view he should not have accepted the appointment. And if President Johnson had known about assassination plots that were being considered by the CIA, both in the last years of the Eisenhower administration and in the early years of the Kennedy administration, he would not have appointed Dulles.
And by assassination plots, you mean against Castro, the CIA?
Assassination. Yes, yeah. Yes. They were interested in assassinating other people as well, which had a long tradition in the CIA. But they were focusing on Castro as of 1960 through 1963.
All right, just very briefly before we talk about the staff, how much interaction did the two of you have with the commissioners, personally?
You want to start, Howard?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I had basically no communication with the commissioners. My partner Leon Hubert and I had lunch with the Chief Justice on one occasion, and that's the only member of the commission I ever met.
Okay, Howard?
Yeah, I think actually it's one of the weaknesses of presidential commissions generally is that the commission fails to take sufficient recognition of the contributions of the staff. And the staff, of course, always think they're smarter than the members of the commission. And the commission members always think they have better judgment and impressive credentials. And there has to be a way to sort of breach this gap. I spent a fair amount of time with the Chief Justice in meetings. I met with McCloy from time to time. He subsequently claimed publicly that I had denied him important materials because I had locked them in the desk in my office. And when I heard about this, I tried to recall carefully exactly what kind of a desk I had at the building. And my clear recollection is that if it had a central drawer, I'd never had a key to it in any event. But McCloy was seriously engaged in the work of the commission. He took on some issues like presidential protection with some enthusiasm. He was free and to argue with the Chief Justice about matters, and he made a substantial contribution.
All right, let's talk about the staff, because this is interesting. You have the commissioners, and then the people who are really going to do the work are going to be the staff, but they're set up much like a law firm. And the guy who headed this law firm, or the general counsel of this firm, is J. Lee Rankin. We'll talk about him. His two lieutenants are Norman Redlich and you, Howard Willins. And then we know that you then set up teams of two, a senior partner and a junior associate, which we'll get to. Let's talk about this guy who is the general counsel, so to speak, of the staff, Lee Rankin. Describe who he was.
Yeah, Lee Rankin was a moderate Republican from Nebraska who had joined the Department of Justice in 1953 at the onset of the Eisenhower administration as an assistant attorney general in charge of the Office of Legal Counsel. And in 1956, he became the Solicitor General of the United States and argued on behalf of the government in the Supreme Court frequently, including arguments on the Brown v. Education Board case, which was a landmark case, 1950, I forget, 54, I think. He was well known to the Chief Justice. The Chief Justice had a first choice for the position, but his colleagues on the commission felt that his candidate was too closely aligned with the Chief Justice, having worked with him in previous capacities for more than 15 years. So J. Lee Rankin was a very important second choice and was very highly qualified. He had years of experience in dealing with people of the credentials that were reflected on the commission. He had a good manner in dealing with them. He was, I thought, a good staff director. Some people felt he didn't get out enough and interact with the members of the staff, but he always was ready to listen to members of the staff who had ideas or criticisms of where we were going, and I think he did a sterling job.
So he's kind of a lawyer's lawyer. Solicitor General, you think of Robert Bork and Ken Starr, appears before the Supreme Court, so knows Warren very well. He will be critical for the staff because he is really the guy who interacts with the commission and the staff. He is the main interacting point between you guys and that. So an important guy. Here's a very handsome guy. Howard Willens. This is actually, where was this picture taken?
I'm on the right. Yes, this was taken in the Texas School Book Depository. After the Ruby trial was concluded, the Warren Commission was free then to embark on its investigation in Dallas. We had been asked not to interfere with law enforcement people or witnesses during the pendency of the Ruby trial for obvious reasons, and once that was concluded, I went down there at the request of the General Counsel, Rankin, carrying letters to the mayor and to the police chief, advising them that we were coming to town with lawyers to take depositions. We probably had 50 or 60 already in mind over the next several weeks, and I paid some courtesy calls, and in the process I visited the Texas School Book Depository with David Bellin on the left from Des Moines, Iowa, a liberal Republican that I reached out for early in the search for staff because I was becoming too heavily laden with Democrats from Yale and Harvard.
Yeah, those bad guys. You came out of the Department of Justice, and in fact, were close to Robert Kennedy and reported back to him during this period of time. Maybe you could describe your relationship with him and what he was like during that period and what he was going through.
Well, the important point here is that actually Robert Kennedy did not take an active role in this investigation or have any real contact with the commission. He subsequently wrote the commission in response to a letter saying the only people he talked to about the work of the commission were the Chief Justice, Nick Katzenbach, the deputy, and me. He decided immediately after the assassination that he did not want to be personally involved in reviewing the investigative reports or making any decisions about how to conduct the investigation and what methods should be used to accomplish an inquiry into the facts of his brother's murder. So reports that came in from the FBI, which was put on the job immediately by President Johnson, regardless of whether there was federal jurisdiction or not. President Johnson properly, in my opinion, decided this was a national emergency and the full resources of the federal government should be put to bear promptly after the assassination, and the FBI responded promptly and in great numbers and did a very impressive job in generating within 24 hours and then 48 hours reports of what they had learned about Oswald, his history, and his involvement in this assassination, and began the process of looking more generally for evidence of a conspiracy. So those reports that came from the FBI, although addressed to the Attorney General, went to Katzenbach and to my boss, Herbert J. Miller, Jr., who was from Maryland and with whom I had worked in private practice. And he was the head of the criminal division. And if there was to be a federal role in this matter, it was going to be run by the criminal division. So Jack and I and Nick Katzenbach and the public information officer, Ed Guthman, a close friend of Bob Kennedy's, were the only people who were receiving the FBI reports and trying to decide how to respond to those reports, whether they should be made public, for example, whether there should be public releases about them. And while we were deliberating about whether there would be a federal investigation or whether there might be a presidential commission. So I met with Bob Kennedy on a few occasions. He was very businesslike. When I had my longest session with him, where we discussed how we were going to obtain the testimony of his sister-in-law, Jackie Kennedy, and what was going to be Robert Kennedy's relationship to the commission. He was available to appear as a witness if the commission wanted him to, but because he was not part of the motorcade and did not have any personal information about the events of that day, his preference clearly was not to appear, and the Chief Justice decided that he could perform his role by responding to the Chief Justice's inquiry about whether the Department of Justice had supplied all the relevant information to the commission that the Department of Justice had in its possession, and the Attorney General responded in time that indeed the department had fulfilled its obligations to the commission.
Interesting point here. You say whether this was or was not a federal issue. It was not a crime to shoot, a federal crime to shoot the president. It was a local murder in Texas. And that was a big problem in terms of gathering evidence at different points. All right, so Norman Redlich, so you have Lee Rankin, you, and Norman Redlich are the people kind of running the staff. Describe who Norman Redlich was.
Norman Redlich was a professor of law at NYU. He was a Yale Law School graduate in 1950. He had worked in a family business until the late 1950s when he went to do some advanced work in tax work and began teaching at NYU. He was a terrific scholar. He was very liberal in his affiliations. He was a dedicated man. He was a great colleague, I think, compared with some of the strong egos on the staff, present company accepted. Norman was truly modest and selfless, and he always had a means of attacking public interests, like keeping Mr. Moses from building a highway through Greenwich Village. He did those jobs always in the background, but very effectively. He and I became very close. You should not be misled by these diagrams. we were both called assistant counsels. There was no rigid hierarchy here. Norman was appointed by Rankin to be his special assistant. Norman basically took on special projects, like preparing for the testimony of Marina Oswald. He did other special projects substantively, and I was more on the moving the papers side of the operation, reviewing memoranda. Norman and I would review memorandum. We would consult regularly with Rankin. Rankin told his secretaries a week into 1964 that I should get a copy of everything that went out of his office. So I assembled all the investigative reports. I was the person through whom investigative reports were submitted by staff. But at any time that, for example, if I had difficulties with Bert or Bert had difficulties with me, which happened from time to time, you know, we could always work it out. So there were no orders being given, and the distinction between senior lawyers and junior lawyers and then associates quickly was abandoned. Once lawyers start working together on a common project, it doesn't really matter how old you are, what your credentials are. It depends upon how smart you are and how hard you work and how receptive you are to other person's points of view. And so you had to find people who could work together as a team in order to accomplish this job, which was, you know, of immense importance.
Bert, at one point, Gerald Ford attacked Redlich. He really did not want him to be on the commission. Can you explain that briefly?
Well, Redlich had been a participant in, or I don't even actually know if he was a participant, but he was a member of an organization that J. Edgar Hoover thought was too far to the left, and I can't remember the name of it. The Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, was that?
Something like that.
The Emergency Civil Liberties Committee. And I don't know, do you know, Howard, what role Norman actually played in that? Did he do anything except pay dues or something?
I think the challenge to Norman came from the far right. Norman was engaged in a group that opposed the Senator McCarthy and the House on Un-American Activities. We're talking 1963 now. By that time, McCarthy had gone to his deserved end, and the House on the Un-American Activities was losing impact, but still there were many members of the House who challenged Ford, why are you hiring these goddamn liberals? I mean, it's going to taint the whole report. If you have someone who was opposed to the House on Un-American Activities and he allegedly co-authored an article that announced some, you know, contested the death penalty or some other outrageous liberal cause. So Norman was being besieged with this. His family suffered a great deal of embarrassment. The faculty of NYU submitted a letter attesting to not only his intellect, his integrity, and his loyalty, but they decried the attention that he was getting as a member of the staff. So actually,
ultimately, Earl Warren stood up for him, and as all the staff also.
Absolutely.
You were all very much behind.
The staff was frankly outraged by the attack on Norman, and regardless, necessarily when we get to some of the staff people, you'll see how diverse the staff were from a political perspective. But every one of them, whether you always got along with Norman or not, was outraged by this because we respected his integrity and his hard work.
Right. Okay, let's move on. You had 6 teams set up with a senior lawyer and a junior lawyer to look at 6 different areas. Let's talk about them very briefly. Team 1 was the facts of the assassination. Somebody named Frank Adams and then Arlen Specter. So these are the people that are going to look at the actual facts of the assassination. I don't think we need to talk about Frank Adams because he really did not participate very much. He was a New York City, I think, commissioner of some sort, police commissioner. Talk a little bit about Arlen Specter and his role and his importance to the Warren Commission.
Well, Arlen was one of the 3 people that I identified as ones I wanted to solicit for the commission staff. He was a classmate of mine at law school in 1956. He'd gone on to be a prosecutor. He was in private practice for a short time, but when I called him, he was a prosecutor. He had prosecuted successfully one of the local Teamsters chiefs in Philadelphia. When I called Arlen, as he records, on New Year's Eve, which he recalls more accurately than I do, I asked him whether he'd be interested in being considered for a position on the staff. And so he got this call from a classmate he probably scarcely remembered. He said, well, he was very busy. He just finished his trial. He had to do some post-trial activities and prepare for the inevitable appeal. Said he'd consider it. But he went to a New Year's Eve party that evening, and one of the lawyers there, a future partner of his, after hearing about this conversation, said, Arlen, if you're going to turn this job down, would you recommend me? That brought Arlen around quite quickly, and the next day I got a resume saying that he was uniquely qualified for this assignment.
So he will end up playing a big role in the single bullet theory, which we're going to talk about shortly. But that's Arlen Specter in that team. This next team is Joe Ball and David Bellin. Both of them were very much involved. Joe Ball was a established criminal lawyer from Los Angeles, very much got involved. But tell us about David Bellin, who worked with him, who also was a real firecracker.
Just say the only thing I say about Joe Ball, that he was an established criminal defense lawyer. He also was a very close friend of the Chief Justice's, and he was undoubtedly asked to be on the commission by the Chief himself. David Bellin, as I probably said earlier, was someone that I reached out to again because I knew him at the University of Michigan, and also he was from an area of the country that was not being well represented on the staff and from a different law school. And he was totally devoted to this. In fact, David, after the commission completed its work, spent more personal time and energy in defending the work of the Warren Commission than virtually anyone else on the staff or on the commission. He was thoroughly committed to the work of the commission. He had very strong views about how his work should be organized, written, and edited. And we had some serious exchanges on that point, which were sort of interesting from a lawyer perspective. But in any event, eventually he accepted the organization that was sort of imposed on him and Joe Ball, and he was very good at taking depositions and thoroughly devoted to examining all the evidence with an open mind and recognizing that in the absence of defense counsel for a dead alleged assassin, it was important for members of the staff not to be prosecutors, but to look at the evidence in a way that was fair to the alleged assassin as well as to his family and others associated with him. And David was very much aware of that and was very attuned to making sure the record was complete on the critical issues of Oswald's culpability.
Okay, let's go through the other teams very quickly and then get to some of the topics. Bert Jenner was part of Oswald's domestic conspiracy group. Bert Jenner and Block became the founder of one of the biggest Chicago law firms. Very active trial lawyer. Jim Liebler, both of you knew and liked very well. There's Bert, Jim Liebler, who worked with him. And then Team 4 is interesting, has gotten some news recently.
Can I stop you before you get to this? 'Cause I'd like
Sure.
to say a few words about Jim Liebler because I think it may reflect how people of completely different political and other perspectives can work together on a project and really become close friends. Jim Liebler became my closest friend. Now, if Jim Liebler and I had been in the state legislature or the Congress, we wouldn't have agreed on anything. He was a Milton Friedman economist, and he was a libertarian before anybody ever heard of libertarians. And anybody
a Goldwater Republican?
And he was a Republican, and if anybody knows me, you know that I'm one of the, from a social standpoint, of one of the most conservative people you're ever going to meet, although my politics are liberal.
Yeah.
But Jim and I shared one common characteristic, and that is he was determined. He questioned everything. He was determined to find the truth. I was the same way, and we became closest friends.
That's wonderful. This next team, Oswald Foreign, this is whether or not there was a foreign conspiracy behind the assassination. William Coleman, the only African-American, wonderful distinguished career involved with Thurgood Marshall in Brown v. Board of Education, worked for a New York firm, worked for a Philadelphia firm, But it's been reported in a recent book that he met with Fidel Castro in person, 30 miles off coast from Cuba, to ask him directly in a 3-hour session whether he was involved in the assassination. I'd like to hear both of your reactions to that. Something you didn't know at the time.
You have a reaction?
Yeah, I think I'm quite unclear as to when he met with Castro. Understand that this information, Coleman is in his mid-90s at this point, and I'm not sure that his memory of things is as accurate as it should be. I don't have any doubt that he met with Castro at some point. None of us were ever, at least I never knew about it, and I think Howard's the same way. Howard never knew about it. Dave Slauson, the person who worked closely with him, was never told about it. And so if there was such a meeting, it really was a secret.
If it ever happened, I mean, all I would say would be kudos to everybody. The reason I don't think it happened during the course of the Warren Commission is that the Chief Justice was determined not to have any contact with Cuba. And this came up when we, at the staff level, with David Slauson, wanted to pursue through appropriate channels what the Cuban authorities had done with the request for an in-transit visa that Oswald had applied for on his trip to Mexico in September and early October of 1963. And David was told that the Chief Justice would not believe anything that came from a communist country, so there was no point in asking the communist country what they did on the in-transit visa application. Well, the CIA, I think, properly told David, well, the contacts with the Cuban government are now through the Swiss embassy because we did not have diplomatic relations. So the question was whether we should submit a request through the Swiss to Cuba to get a response. And contrary to the Chief Justice's desires, David violated the Chief Justice's preferences with my support and Rankin's support, actually. And we did solicit the information through the Swiss. My point is simply this: if he didn't want to even make a written application to Cuban authorities with respect to a pedestrian matter like dealing with an application for an in-transit visa, I don't think he would have ever endorsed a visit by any member of the staff with Castro, whether Castro had gotten down on his knees to plea for it. The story is that Castro requested some kind of a meeting, and my view is if that had gotten to the Chief Justice, he would have turned it down cold. It's my view that if this ever happened, it happened in 1967 when President Johnson learned for the first time about assassination plots that were revealed in a Drew Pearson column. There's a voice from your distant past. And President Johnson got briefed on the whole Warren Commission report by the Chief Justice for the first time. And it seems to me that out of that meeting, it may have come a decision to try to reach out to Castro by President Johnson. President Johnson could arrange a meeting like this that doesn't have any documentary support in any branch of the government, so far as we know. I mean, that can only have been run out of the White House, I'm informed by a close relation who worked in the White House in her early years. This is, a matter for speculation. It's a colorful story. And Coleman knew Castro because they used to patronize the same jazz clubs in New York, in Harlem, during the, I guess must have gone back to the 40s.
50s, yeah.
40s or 50s. Yeah. In any event, there's more than you wanted to hear.
Okay. So the only people looking at the Ruby aspect of this, remember there's two murders, obviously, the president and then Ruby with Oswald. The only team doing that is Burke Griffin and Leon Hubert.
Hubert.
So
actually, you've spelled his name wrong. It's Hubert.
Okay. So
and I think they may have pronounced it Hubert.
Hubert.
Because
he's from New Orleans. Okay. So, but Bert, I want to get to the point of you felt very much like you were understaffed, like you had 4 teams looking at Oswald and just 1 team looking at Ruby. Can you talk about that idea?
We couldn't meet the timetable that we were trying to meet and expected to meet because, as I say, we had 2 people investigating one crime, trying to find out if there was a conspiracy, and that was basically, there were basically 2 questions. How did Ruby get into the basement? And did anybody help him get into the basement, or was there any conspiracy between Ruby and anybody to assassinate the president? Was he connected with Oswald in any way? So we were investigating a conspiracy, and we were also trying to figure out why Ruby did what he did. And so there were 2 of us doing that, and 6 others, well, more than that, probably 8 or 9 or 10 people asking the same questions about Oswald. So we, you know, I think this was set up exactly the right way, incidentally. I have no complaints about how the organization was set up. But we did have some burdens that others shared more widely.
Yeah, and it was a very complicated question because Ruby had all these contacts that you had to run down with. I mean,
Ruby was the complete opposite of Oswald. Oswald had contacts with virtually nobody, and Ruby had contacts with everybody, from the police, and his childhood brought him in contact with, you know, the bootleggers, and before there was a mafia as we know it, you know, what was ever happening in bootlegging days, he knew all those people.
All right, so we'll come back and talk a little bit about your investigation, and there's a picture of you. And then the last team is presidential protection. This is the Secret Service, and whether they did their job that day. You have Lee Rankin helping out somebody named Sam Stern. Tell us about Sam Stern.
Sam Stern was the 3rd person that I knew and proposed for the commission staff. He was a former clerk to Chief Justice Warren. He was a Harvard Law School graduate, had clerked for a couple of years, and then went with a firm, Washington law firm, and I knew him and knew about his clerkship, and he was available. He was a corporate lawyer with a lot of experience in international dealings, and so but he was smart and creative and a thoughtful lawyer, and I thought he would bring a set of skills to the commission that would be important. So his job was very much isolated from all the rest of the groups. It was the only forward-looking aspect of the commission's work. It was, for the Chief Justice, the most important because of that. And because of that, in fact, the Chief Justice asked Rankin to personally work with Sam on this project. I got involved in a lot of the presidential protection meetings with the Secretary of the Treasury and his executive assistant and Chief Rowley of the Secret Service. But Sam was not only involved in trying to figure out how best to recommend improvements in presidential protection, but also look at the information gathering systems at the FBI, the CIA, and the Secret Service to see how the exchange of information among intelligence operations in the United States could be improved. I remind you, this was 1964, and that what I've just described is, of course, a problem that's been with us every decade since and was the central focus of the 9/11 Commission some 10 years ago.
Okay, so that's our staff. Before we actually get to the 2 major findings, Bert, in addition to that staff, you had fact checkers. I think it's worth spending a second on that.
I want to mention something about it. Thanks, Jim. We had thousands of footnotes. Everything. If anybody's read the Warren reports, you know that virtually every sentence we had was footnoted. And our fact checkers included a young guy by the name of Stephen Breyer, who was, at that point, I think, he's risen a little bit since then, but he was our fact checker. We had another Supreme Court clerk who is now a Court of Appeals judge in California.
John Hart Eli.
Well, then he's John Hart Eli, who became the dean, I think, first at Berkeley, wasn't he, and then Florida. So you had a term that you described these guys.
Yeah, a dream team of
yeah, it's
lawyers.
unbelievable. So, and if you could imagine that somehow we were going to get these people to engage in some kind of concealment effort, it just wasn't within their nature, and they all would have quit if they had thought, and I would have quit too, if we had felt that we were going to conceal something. And you don't, when you conceal something, you don't write a report that in your footnotes cites you to the contesting, not only the things that support you in the footnotes, but as we learned as lawyers writing law review articles, you got to cite both sides. And most of the critics who I mean, we made the critics possible, I would say, because we published everything that we thought was relevant, and we even cited them to the things that didn't agree with our conclusions.
All right, so let's talk about the two major findings. Oswald was the lone assassin, and that he acted alone, and there's no evidence of a conspiracy. Howard, you, in your book, you recount the facts about why you believe the evidence was overwhelming that Oswald was the lone assassin. You've got 5 different elements here. Let's talk about them.
Yes, I think it's important to just focus for a minute on this and to be reminded that the Warren Commission findings that we're focusing on now have been re-examined time and time again in the last nearly 5 decades. And there are a couple of examples of that, but one reason that my book is so firm in its declaration that history has proved us right is that first I had confidence in our findings in 1964, but because information had been withheld from agencies, because the doors were always open to additional information, deathbed confessions, jilted spouses, and so forth and so on, none of which had come to light, and the whole findings were re-examined by a House of Representatives committee in the late 1970s, and they stand behind all of these conclusions with respect to Oswald. The 2 rifle, there were 3 shots. The commission believed, although the testimony ran from 2 shots on one hand to 6 shots on the other. The commission concluded there were 3 shots and that 1 missed, but that the president and the governor, Connolly, were hit from above and behind by two shots, which caused all the wounds on both men. Secondly, the shots were fired from the 6th floor depository. There were eyewitnesses that saw Oswald at the window with the rifle. The ballistics evidence demonstrated that the bullets that caused the injury came from the rifle. Oswald owned the rifle. Oswald had carried the rifle into the building that morning, representing to the fellow worker who drove him into work that he had curtain rods contained in a brown bag because his apartment needed new curtain rods. He had access to the room on the 6th floor. Employees on the 5th floor below his nest of boxes heard the cartridges fall on the floor above them. He left the depository, which we think probably was a surprise to him that he was able to leave. We don't believe he had any plan of escape at all. He fully expected either to be captured, be shot, and he didn't care. And then in the process, he went back to his apartment, changed his jacket, picked up his revolver, then went off in a direction which we don't know exactly whether there was a destination or not. And he was stopped by Tippett in a patrol car because there had been a eyewitness description, as I've suggested, and that was communicated over the police transmission system to all the officers patrolling. Tippett stopped him, and as Tippett was walking around the car to interrogate Oswald pulled out the rifle and shot him in the chest 4 times. I've just been told by a conspiracy theorist who I've been consulting with that in fact there was a wallet found on the scene, and there now has been some reinvestigation actually by a former FBI agent who now has said that the evidence is clear that the wallet, blood streamed and everything under Tippett's body was not Tippett's wallet, as had been generally assumed. It was Oswald's wallet, and that there's it's more convincing evidence that it was in fact Oswald who killed Tippett, but that particular fact has never been made clear in all the investigations to date. So
Can I say,
haven't filled my colleague in on that.
It's nonsense. No wallet was found that belonged to somebody else, and Oswald's wallet was found right on him when he was arrested, and it had the fake identification with his picture in it.
See,
so that tells you where some of this.
That's the established position.
Yeah, this is the establishment
but
story.
I'm here to tell you that new facts come to light virtually every day. So in any event, you know the story, and these are the most important fact on this list really is that the 2 bullets that caused the injury to both men were found, either remnants were found in the car, and the nearly whole bullet showed up at a stretcher at the hospital to which they both men were taken. So there's no evidence of a second shooter. I mean, not to mention a third or fourth or fifth. I mean, whoever was shooting in the Oliver Stone movie or whatever you've read about, if their bullets hit anyone, they F&S'd into nothingness. There are no remnants of any bullet in that car that came from any source other than Oswald's rifle. So even whether the shot came from the front, the side, beneath, or whatever, I mean, it had to leave some residue in the car if, in fact, it injured one of the occupants or it hit the car, and there is no such evidence. So all that stuff about second shooters just has no factual evidence whatsoever. No one was seen, never was a second rifle, never was a fourth cartridge, never was a third bullet, and no one was ever seen. And so one can talk about potential conspiracies involving Oswald or involving Ruby, but the point is that the bulk of the conspiracy theorists do not accept this evidence with respect to Oswald, or they believe that there was one or two fake Oswalds wandering around the streets taking pot shots at whoever was available.
Okay, so here we see a picture of Oswald with the rifle. This is the one that was taken by Marina and later found. No evidence of a conspiracy. You know, obviously the biggest problem that you have here is that in a police basement, a guy gets in and kills Oswald 2 days later. And this is the area that you investigated, Bert.
Right.
Why did you reach the conclusion that there was no conspiracy? And maybe we can start with this timing question that I think is the most interesting evidence about the Ruby part of this. It's the Western Union telegram. Why don't you describe that?
Look, first of all, who was Ruby? Ruby was a striptease club operator. And
you got something against striptease.
nothing against them. But Ruby, from the moment he heard that Kennedy had been shot, became convinced that this was all part of some conspiracy to discredit the Jews and blame this. It was an anti-Semitic conspiracy of some sort. I won't go into those details.
But it's because there was an ad November 22nd
that morning there was
in the
a full-page ad in the Dallas Morning News in a very subtle way but clear way attacking President Kennedy. It was a black bordered ad, and it was signed by a man whose name was Bernard Weissman. And Ruby, Jewish community was relatively small in Dallas. Ruby had never heard of Bernard Weissman, so he started his own conspiracy investigation to find who this guy Weissman was. He looked in the telephone directory. Couldn't find Ruby's name in or Weissman's name in the telephone directory. Looked in a street directory. Couldn't find Weissman's name there. Went to services that Friday night, asked his rabbi if he knew Bernard Weissman. The rabbi had never heard of Bernard Weissman. So he became convinced that somehow the Jews were going to be falsely blamed and Bernard Weissman didn't exist. Actually, Bernard Weissman did exist, and he was I think from Oklahoma. But in any event, Ruby had this obsession, and he had great sympathy for President Kennedy, and out of sympathy for President Kennedy, he closed his striptease clubs. He had 2 of them. He closed them Friday and Saturday night, and obviously his strippers didn't get paid as a result of that. So on Sunday morning, one of his strippers, known as Little Lynn, her real name was Karen Carlin, Little Lynn said she was out of money, needed to pay her landlord, and needed money for food. Ruby said, okay, I'll go down to the Western Union office and send you a money order.
And here's a picture of it across the street.
There's the money, there's the Western Union station.
And that's across the street from the Dallas Police Department.
Across the street from the Dallas Police Station. And incidentally, he drove down, and in his car, he had his favorite dog, Sheba. He parked the car across the street from the Western Union office, left the dog in the car in the parking lot, sent this telegram, a money order, 4 minutes before he shot Oswald. Waited in line, incidentally, waited behind somebody. So if this was a conspirator waiting in line to send a money order, it's kind of strange. He saw this crowd gathered outside of the police station, and
Goes down perhaps this.
goes down this ramp. There was a guard at the top of the ramp. My guess is that Ruby might have known the guard, or the guard might have known Ruby. Ruby goes in, and then within about 2 minutes after Ruby arrives down there, Oswald comes out and he shoots him.
I mean, it really sounds impulsive if he's doing that 4 minutes earlier.
And let me just add this one thing. The detective named Jack Revel from the Dallas Police Department, whose job was to keep track of organized crime in Dallas, testified before Congressman Stokes' committee in the late 70s that reinvestigated the assassination. And when Revel was asked if Ruby was a part of organized crime, Revel's answer was, if Ruby was a part of organized crime needs a new human resources director.
So the other part of this story is that Oswald's movement out of this jail to the county jail had been delayed unexpectedly that morning too. Do you have that part of the story, Howard?
Sure. He was supposed to be moved at 10 o'clock in the morning. Postal inspector wanted to interview him before he got moved to the Dallas County Sheriff's County Jail. And so unexpectedly, the transfer didn't occur at 10 o'clock in the morning where the news media thought it was. It occurred about 11:30 in the morning.
Yeah. So all that together suggests to you
11:21, I think it was.
that what Ruby was doing was very impulsive at this point.
Yes.
Okay. By the way, the other thing he talked about is that morning he got up and there was an article in the newspaper about Jackie Kennedy having to come perhaps if Oswald didn't confess.
And you know, that's right. And Ruby was very concerned that she was going to have to testify. This emotionally affected him. Incidentally, he also told us that he was on a weight reduction drug called Preludin, which can have an emotional effect on you. And when Ruby was wrestled to the ground and first interrogated by the police, the first thing he said was, "I had to show the world that you had guts." And then later on, when he testified before Chief Justice Warren, he mentioned both his feelings that this would, in his mind, redeem the Jewish people from any criticism, any suggestion that they were part of some conspiracy, and he mentioned his concern and sympathy for Mrs. Kennedy.
Yeah, interesting story. All right, let's do one more topic, then we'll open it up for questions. I want to talk about this topic before we open this up. There was no template that these guys had to work with. Let's think about the other assassinations in American history. This is a picture of the Booth conspirators, Mary Surratt and Louis Payne and David Axelrod, before they were hung for after a trial. But there's no question there were lots of witnesses to that assassination, close in, and there was a conspiracy trial, a criminal trial. So we have that precedent. Then we have, as I told Howard, we know about presidential assassinations here in northeastern Ohio. 50% of the assassins are of the president's assassinated are from this area. So William McKinley was assassinated by a man who walked up to him at some event in Buffalo.
Reception.
Yeah, and he was captured on the spot, so there was no question there. He was tried and executed. And then same thing with Charles Guiteau and James Garfield. Walked up to him in the train station in Washington, shot from behind, captured at that point, tried and executed. So you don't have any precedent at all here for a commission and for a crime that is not going to have a trial. Could you talk about that and how that, what do you do when you face a situation like this where you have no template? How do you come up with what you're going to do and your plan of action?
Well, I was at the Justice Department at the time, as you've heard, and we in the criminal division did not know what our role was going to be, if any, with respect to this matter. But Mr. Miller asked some of the lawyers in our division to start preparing an outline of what a full investigation of the assassination and its aftermath with Ruby would embrace. And it's sort of a traditional legal job. You sit down and you wonder about how you would begin to organize an investigation, working outward from the facts of the crime and associates to the broader inquiries you'd have to make if you were going to make judgments about conspiracies or motive. I mean, the lawyers in the audience know that a conspiracy is really just another word for an agreement. It just requires two people to agree on a plan of conduct. And if it happens to be an illegal objective you're pursuing, it's a crime if you form such an agreement and you take one overt act to effectuate and achieve your objective. So to investigate a conspiracy, you need to be looking as broadly as you can to see what kind of relationships might evidence such an agreement or have provided support to Ruby or Oswald in what they actually did on those days. So the criminal division began to work on an outline of an investigation, and in fact, when I went to the commission several weeks later, I took that with me and used that as a basis from which to develop a proposed outline of our investigation through these various groups. And that was viewed, embellished by Norman Redlich and Lee Rankin, and that's what went to the commission for approval. So we basically wanted people to absorb all the thousands of investigative materials that the agencies produced, and the commission had decided early on it did not want to rely on agencies exclusively. It wanted to conduct its own investigation and secure sworn testimony. And we ended up talking to 552 witnesses on the basis of which the commission reached its judgment. So there was no template, to be sure, and we did not even know that there was going to be a presidential commission, but we thought as a precautionary measure, the criminal division lawyers ought to at least turn their brains and experience to trying to outline what such an investigation would look like, and that was the nucleus from which we built to conduct the work of the commission.
Last point, Bert. How massive was this investigation? You had about 6 or 7 months to get it all done.
Well, I think that there was something like 25,000 people were interviewed by either the FBI, the Dallas Police, the Secret Service, the Post Office Department, Treasury Department. You can just run them on down. The complete investigatory resources of the federal government plus the Dallas local authorities were massive, plus other people, and Howard may talk about that. We brought in the U.S. Army. I think that the Atomic Energy Commission even did some investigation for us. Do you want to add to this?
No.
Okay.
All right.
Well, just the bottom line is it's the most massive criminal investigation ever conducted in the United States, and I think it still remains that. And I think Bert's correct about it, the 25,000 interviews, and then we did, as I said, we reduced it to about 552 witnesses, most of whom provided sworn testimony before the commission or sworn testimony in depositions or gave affidavits. And that was the raw material on which the commission made its findings. And as I said, the matter was reinvestigated again in the late 70s, as we've both referred to. And they reached the same conclusion, that there were no conspiracies involving the Soviet Union, Cuba, the Mafia, anti-Castro exiles, or any agency of the federal government. So that basic conclusion of no credible evidence of a conspiracy was the commission's conclusion. It did not say there is no conspiracy, because we knew that our time was limited. Our investigation, no matter how comprehensive, still left loose ends, and it was opened the door to future evidence that might come to light.
All right, so why don't we open it up for questions here? And we have someone back here with a microphone, and so get the microphone before you start asking the question.
If Ruby hadn't shot Oswald and Oswald was convicted, would there have been a need for something like the Presidential Commission beyond just the Texas justice system?
I think probably not. I think the fact that Oswald was not available for trial necessitated some respected fact-finding mechanism And it's my view that the public was much more prepared to accept the facts that come to light in a traditional trial with lawyers for the prosecutor and defense contesting over the believability, credibility of witnesses, and depend on a jury to resolve conflicts of fact. I think they respect that kind of factual record more than they would any presidential commission, and I think that's inherently a weakness in the presidential commission mechanism as a fact-finding a substitute for a trial. So I do think that the choice of a presidential commission here was a wise and necessary choice because it was the only way to avoid conflicting investigations at the Texas District Court level, at the state level, and in both houses of Congress. So I agree with the sense that there would not have been a need for a presidential commission in the absence of Ruby's killing Oswald.
Good.
I just want to know, in your opinions, what is the strongest evidence that there was a conspiracy? Are there any facts that really jumped out at you that really raised an eyebrow that there was a conspiracy? I've heard something about the number of times Tippit was shot and the type of revolver he would have had to fire that many shots.
Bert,
Before answering that question,
Yeah.
you went in with the idea that you really did want to find a conspiracy.
absolutely. As I said, you know, if I could have found a conspiracy, I'd have been the senator from Ohio, not John Glenn. So, you know, I hate to answer your question this way, but there is no evidence of a conspiracy. What's the best evidence? It doesn't exist. It's a fantasy on the part of people who take a bit of evidence, such as they're talking about that somehow Tippit was not really shot by Oswald. There were two people who actually saw him shooting. There were at least 7 others who saw him fleeing the scene. They all identified him later in a lineup.
The gun that he had with him matched the bullets.
I mean, the evidence is overwhelming, but believe it or not, there are people who can make up these stories, such as Oswald just told you about. It wasn't that some other wallet was found under Tippit. I mean, come on. Those are the only people who, the people who dreamed this up are the only ones that have found it. That there is no evidence.
How did Ruby know on Friday night that Oswald was a part of the Fair Play for Cuba committee?
Oh, because it was within hours. It was announced on radio and television. And you know, the whole bit about Ruby, if I could say.
By the way, just so that everybody knows the question that's being asked, that night, Friday night, Ruby is actually in the police station, and Henry Wade references not Fair Play for Cuba or something, and he corrects him back in the back. Ruby does.
Wade called it the Free Cuba Committee.
Yeah.
And Ruby, incidentally, who by that time was trying to impersonate a newspaper reporter, and said that he was a representative of the Israeli press.
Right.
And there's a wonderful photograph of Ruby standing up at this press conference that Henry Wade is at, and Oswald is being displayed to the press, and Ruby's got a notepad and a pencil. And incidentally, he had a gun at the same time with him in his pocket. If he wanted to kill Oswald, he could have killed him right then.
And it would have been the logical time if it was a conspiracy
Right.
to shut him up before he starts
so
talking.
this business, you know, how people can construct conspiracies out of a total absence of evidence absolutely amazes me.
I accept completely your view that there was no conspiracy and all your reasons why. But it seems that conspiracy theorists started in 1964. I mean, I'm sure that's not true completely, but
1963, I think
Well,
even. Yeah, right
All
away.
across Europe.
Ruby thought there was a conspiracy.
what do you attribute that reaction, the degree of that reaction to this event more than any other event? Is it the fact that there was no trial because Oswald was killed and it had to be a federal commission, or is it the gravity of the situation, or is there anything else specific about it that created such a reaction?
Well, one is, I think, our inability at that time to identify a motive. Secondly, I think the fact that the most powerful man in the world is killed by one of the least powerful people in the world. It doesn't make people feel good to think that things could have happened that way. So somebody has to come up with an explanation of why it happened. And there are just many people. Then as we've gone on in time, there are some people who just won't believe anything that the federal government tells them. And incidentally, we weren't part of the federal government. As we went down this list, Jim Liebler and I, my dear friend from North Dakota, who didn't agree with me on anything politically and wouldn't work for the federal government at that time, I think if he'd been offered to do that. But somehow we got these people who think that the rest of us were tied up. We're part of the concealment, part of the conspiracy.
Over here.
Mr. Willins, you mentioned that Chief Justice Warren didn't agree with sending information to the Cubans for response to something, and I believe I heard a public radio interview with you or some other author, but I think it was you, that said there were other things that the Chief Justice wouldn't let the commission investigate. For instance, there was some woman who'd interviewed Oswald in Mexico City and was available to testify, but we weren't allowed to go and interview her. Can you comment on the relationship in terms of what the Chief Justice wouldn't let you do as staff and what you would have liked to have done, or that whole interaction basically?
Yeah, I think there has been some misunderstanding on that score with respect to Mexico City. I went to Mexico City with Bill Coleman and David Slauson, and we worked with the head of the FBI and the CIA down there to explore some outstanding allegations that involved possible Cuban involvement and Oswald meeting with people who allegedly gave him money in return for promising to shoot the president. And you may be referring to the Mexican clerk, a woman named Sylvia Duran, reportedly an attractive woman in her 20s who was working as a substitute in the Cuban consulate. She was a Mexican citizen, and we went down there. The Mexican authorities would not let us interview her. She'd been arrested a couple of times by the Mexican authorities after the assassination, and she had given a fairly detailed statement of her dealings with Oswald. And we got a copy of that report, which was confirmed not by interviewing Mrs. Duran, but by the wiretaps that we had in place that confirmed the conversations with the two consulates that she referred to in her interview. So we felt we had a fairly clear picture of that. Now, the Mexican authorities were very jealous of their sovereignty in those days, and still are, but they did not want us to be appearing to be second-guessing their investigation, which, of course, had led to their conclusion that no one in Mexico was, a participant in any aspect of Oswald's activities. Now, 12 years later, when the House Select Committee investigated the Mexico incident in more detail and with more time than we had, they sent down two people and they interviewed Mrs. Duran for 119 pages of transcript. And she was very forthcoming, and she confirmed what she had said before. She denied, in essence, having an affair with Lee Harvey Oswald. Even the thought of that I find revulsive. But that's been one of the rumors that's been recently publicized in a well-known author's book on this subject. And I think it's, first of all, it's absolutely irrelevant to the substance of the investigation, and it appeals to our common prurient interest. But the fact is, Duran, in fact, was encountered by this author recently. At the age of 76, she was coming home from the grocery store, and this reporter was out there ready to confront her, and went up and didn't help her unload the shopping results, but immediately said, Mrs. Duran, tell us about your affair with Lee Harvey Oswald. And she, of course, politely smiled and demurred and said she was a married woman, and that was ridiculous. He was too short. So I find that thoroughly credible. But in any event, they did, in other words, 12 years later, people did get access to Mrs. Duran. The Mexican government had a much more lenient policy toward U.S. investigative activities. And also that committee also did what we were unable to do, and that is they really took a critical, detailed look at the CIA's records regarding Oswald. Because, you know, of all the areas where we were denied information, in my view, the CIA's failures were the most important in terms of our investigation. And if we'd had more information, we would have had a broader range of inquiry, you know, to investigate before reaching a conclusion about a conspiracy. So we were denied that opportunity, but the House Select Committee 12 years later had it looked at these records. They summoned 50 witnesses who used to work at the CIA or were at the CIA to go over the records and the history of the CIA's involvement. And the bottom line is that the CIA was interested in Oswald. Guess why? Because he was a defector and he came back to the United States. And of course the CIA would want to know where his contacts were, because there always was the possibility that he was an agent. And you wanted, and even if he wasn't, you wanted to see who he was connected with in any way. So that was more or less the fundamental explanation for the CIA's interest. But it was complicated in our time because they had refused to tell us the truth about their assassination plots against Castro.
All right, we have reached the witching hour, I think.
Yes.
What's that?
One witness back.
One more question, okay.
Did the commission look into the activities at all, the planning, the degree of protection afforded the president that day by the Secret Service?
Yes, we certainly did, and we found serious deficiencies. I mean, to our surprise, they did not at the time inspect the buildings along the route. The only place they said where they did that as a matter of routine was in Washington, D.C., not when he traveled. So it did not do that. The liaison with the local law enforcement authorities was totally undisciplined. There were oral communications as to what the local people would do and what the federal people would do. And that was a serious deficiency. The several members of the detail were out drinking the night before. Does that sound familiar? In terms of some of the experiences we've heard about in the last few years. So the culture of the agency was not really what you would want in a law enforcement organization. Our recommendations in that area were limited, because the fundamental question was, well, do you take the Secret Service responsibility away from the Treasury Department, where it had been since 1865, and move it somewhere else? Or where would you move it? Well, the candidate would be the Department of Justice, with the FBI playing a role. Well, Hoover didn't want any part of it, and in view of what we knew now, or knew about Hoover and his lies to the commission wouldn't have supported that. Dulles had a fairly good suggestion, I thought, but there was no support for a major transfer like that, and Secretary Dillon is a very talented secretary with a very shrewd negotiator, and basically he wanted to retain a Secret Service agency within his department because, among other reasons, it let him know every day where the president was. And as a cabinet member, that's of some considerable, has some considerable market value. So.
All right, well, you've been listening today to the you've been listening to Howard Willens and Burke Griffin. They have a big day tomorrow, so I think we're going to wrap things up, and thank you all for coming tonight.